Welcome, everybody. We always wait a few seconds before we jump in because it does take a minute for all of the connections to be made when you've got a lot of people on a Zoom event. So I'll just make a few kind of preliminary comments, and by the time I'm done with that, hopefully everybody will be tuned in. So I'm John Hinderaker, first of all, president of American Experiment, and Bill Glahn is going to be primarily doing this webinar today. And the occasion, of course, is the first Feeding Our Future case to go to trial, scheduled to begin trial on Monday. If you have questions as we go along, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so if you have a question, click that Q&A tab and type in your question. I'm going to keep an eye on the questions as we go along. And, no promises, but if I see questions that I think are appropriate to ask at that moment, clarifying something that Bill has just said or something like that, I may ask them, at the time, and otherwise we will hold questions until the end when the presentation is done. So I think we've got, well, people are still joining, but let's go ahead and jump in. Bill, I think the people that are joining us here have got a pretty good idea of what the Feeding Our Future scandal is all about. Maybe start by talking a little bit about the prosecutors. There's a number of people who have been prosecuted. Obviously, charges have been brought. Many people have pled guilty. The prosecutors broke the whole issue down into a number of different cases. And maybe start, Bill, by explaining, how did the prosecutors do that? How did they break it down into different cases? And what case is this that's now slated to go to trial on Monday?
Right. So you're correct. So they've indicted 70 people in the entire case. 18 have pled guilty. Of those 18, none have been sentenced yet because we haven't had any trials. I think they're waiting to see how cooperative these guilty parties are. But what they did in indictments, they broke them up into batches. And for organizing purposes, each batch of defendants is organized around a food vendor, usually a restaurant or some sort of grocery that was supposed to have been the hub of the feeding effort for the Feeding Our Future groups. And so this particular group is organized around a restaurant, and I think we have a photo of it. I took a picture a couple of years ago of this restaurant in Shakopee, and the restaurant's called Empire Cuisine and Market. And so the group of 8, there are 8 defendants in this group, are all somehow related to this restaurant down in Shakopee. Now, the restaurant is defunct. There's a new business in this space. It's a little strip mall. There's a tire store in this little shopping center. And they've changed the facade on it. So if you drive to this neighborhood in Shakopee, it's not even going to look like this anymore. But the 2 lead defendants in this group are individuals, and they're named Abdi Aziz Farah and Mohammed Ismail. And I apologize if I'm butchering their names. I'm sure we'll learn on Monday when the trial starts how to pronounce these names. But the 2 lead defendants of these 8 are the owners, the co-owners of this former restaurant in Shakopee, which was the hub of this network. And the 3rd lead defendant in this group is somebody they were business associates of, and his name is Mahad Ibrahim. Mahad Ibrahim, he ran a nonprofit called Think Tech Act. And this nonprofit called Think Tech Act, and also had another associated brand called Mind Foundry, was located, there's their corporate logo, Think Tech Act, was located at a co-working facility at the Southdale Mall in Edina. So those are the 3 lead plaintiffs, or not plaintiffs, defendants in this case. Of the 8, the other 5 are people who were business associates or relatives of some of the others. And they all had associations with that restaurant. And 6 of the 8 were also associated with a charter school, a public charter school in Burnsville called Gateway STEM Academy. And they've tried to organize this in groups, affinity groups, if you will, to try to make it into manageable chunks.
So you said there's 8 defendants. Are they all individuals? No corporate defendants in the case?
Yes. So there are lots and lots of corporate entities who are mentioned in trial exhibits and indictments, but none of them are no corporate entities being charged with any criminal charge. It's only these 8 defendants, individuals.
And the names, as you read them off, sounded like Somali names to me. Is this 100% Somali
Yes.
operation?
All 8 are Somali ethnicity. Not all of them are, some of them are Somali ethnic, but they come from a neighboring country. So they're not all former Somali citizens, but they're all Somali ethnic people.
Now, this case, and maybe we should just kind of start at square one in talking about it. What court is this case in?
Yeah, so the case is going to be in federal court in Minneapolis. And I'm kind of anticipating your next question is, what are they charged with? What are the charges against? So each of them has been charged with 4 felony counts. And in federal court, to make this a federal case, they've got to find some nexus, interstate nexus. So they're all being charged with wire fraud. So that's the charge where they're using computers or telephone lines or some interstate communications network to commit fraud, to steal the money. And the U.S. attorney has, in the last filing I saw, they've accused this group of taking $49 million out of these free food programs, these 2 free food programs that are federally operated, but in the state, they're managed by the State Department of Education. And so these 8 people have been charged with a count of wire fraud each, a count of money laundering, and that's how they've taken through financial transactions or trying to hide the source, convert money from these nonprofits into their own personal use, their own personal bank accounts. And then for the wire fraud and the money laundering, each has been charged with conspiracy around those 2 counts. So the federal prosecutors are going to try to prove that these 8 work together in a conspiracy to defraud the government of $49 million that they use for their own purposes.
So $49 million, that's something like 10% of what I think you've said you think the whole Feeding Our Future scandal might amount to. More than that in terms of what the U.S. Attorney's Office has actually added up. So this is a big chunk of the case.
Right. And again, the U.S. attorney put out that $250 million number for the first batch of indictments. And even though there have been many batches of indictments since, he's never updated the number. He's just said, he says that's the floor, not the ceiling. And, he's not in the business of, updating this number in real time. So I've estimated it probably will end up around 500 million, just based on my analysis of the groups involved. And not to complicate matters too much, but there is a splinter group. There was these 8 defendants, and then the last batch of indictments, which occurred a couple of months ago, there was another group of 7 defendants who are all related to this group, but for whatever reason weren't indicted earlier and now have been indicted. So almost all of those 7 get mentioned in court documents and trial exhibits, but they're not actually on trial, but they're going to get mentioned in the court at some point.
So to go back to the charges for a moment, I think the average citizen would probably think, well, they stole money, right? I mean, it's theft, theft by swindle. I don't know, whatever. And of course, those are all state crimes, right? And so I assume that these are being prosecuted in federal court, at least in part, because these are federal taxpayer dollars that got stolen under a program that was administered by the state of Minnesota, but they're federal taxpayer dollars. Is that the fundamental reason, do you think, why this is in federal court, or is there something else?
I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to the question, because I've seen state prosecutions of Medicaid fraud, which is a federal program, and they charge them with those kind of crimes you mentioned, which are state crimes. I think it might have been a resources issue, that this is such a huge undertaking. There have been 70 people charged. I've seen reports that there are perhaps 200 and 250 people who could be charged eventually, or were thought to be part of the scheme. We mentioned these 8. If you look at the list of trial exhibits, there are dozens of other names of people who appear to be unindicted co-conspirators. And again, there's the investigation that was undertaken involved a bunch of federal agencies. It was the FBI, it was the Internal Revenue Service. You name a federal agency, they were involved in this. So I think it might have, at the end of the day, been a resources issue.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense too. So wire fraud, basically it's theft when you charge it as a federal crime and you show that they used a telephone or a computer or something, as you probably would nowadays. And so you can take that crime and federalize it. And money laundering in this case just means there was a nonprofit, alleged nonprofit that got money, and then the people who run the nonprofit, got the money out of it. And that's what they call money laundering, right?
Correct.
So this is in federal court. What judge is it in front of?
Her name is Nancy Brazel. She's on the federal bench. I know you've done a little research on her. She was appointed by a Democrat governor when she was a state judge, and then she's a Trump appointee to the federal bench. So we're actually not sure where her politics lie, if anywhere.
Yeah, she's young enough that I don't know her. She's only been on the federal bench since 2018. She was appointed by Trump, recommended by Amy Klobuchar. So, but she looks like she has a pretty good background. She was an assistant U.S. attorney for several years, and she's got all of the Feeding Our Future cases, right? They're all kind of consolidated.
Right. So they've all been consolidated in her. Every time they have a new round of indictments, it just gets automatically assigned to whatever judge is next on the list, and then they go and file to have it transferred to her. So she has the entire scandal in her chambers.
Now, this is a white collar crime case, obviously, and that tends to involve a lot of filings, a lot of documents, rather complicated issues of proof. And I know you have been reading the filings by the prosecutor and the various defense lawyers. So let me just pause there for a moment. Are these people separately represented? Are we looking at 8 defense lawyers?
More than 8. So each has their own lawyer. And I keep seeing, you mentioned these filings. I keep seeing filings where each defendant's adding another lawyer to its team. So I don't know how many lawyers are going to be in the room Monday morning when they gavel in, but each of the 8 defendants has at least one lawyer of their own, separate from the other 8, maybe sometimes 2 or 3.
And I know there've been a lot of filings, and you've looked at a lot of paper in the case. How would you describe what are some takeaways from the pretrial filings that you've been looking at?
Well, we'll dig into that, but there's been something like 500 documents filed in this case. It takes a couple of seconds just for the list of documents to load. And I spent the last week and a half going through just one document, and that is the prosecutor's exhibit list. Just the list of exhibits, not the exhibits, just the list of exhibits, single space, runs 119 pages. They have somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 separate exhibits in the case, and that's just the prosecutor's list. The defense, each of the 8 defendants has filed their own list of exhibits. There's a lot of overlap between all these lists, but they've filed lists that run 20, 30 pages and hundreds of exhibits. So just the sheer amount of paperwork involved. And not all the exhibits are paper. There's some photographs, videos, all kinds of physical objects that are going to be introduced. But there's reports of the total case involves literally millions of pages of documents.
I did civil litigation, as you know, for many years, Bill, and if cases are going to settle, they often settle at the 11th hour on the proverbial courthouse steps. That can be true of guilty pleas as well. Is there any indication that this case might collapse between now and Monday, or are the parties really cruising toward a jury trial?
I really think they're going to gavel in on Monday and they're going to go, because you mentioned these different groups. Of the 70 groups, there are probably 7 or 8 different combinations of defendants. And almost all the other groups have had people who have peeled off and pled guilty. Not this group. This group of 8 has held together as a group for the last 10 years, or the last 2 years, right? 2 years. I don't see any cracks between them. There've been a couple of previews of this trial, other than what you and I are doing, where they talk to legal experts who say, well, maybe these defendants will start turning on each other and start pointing fingers at their fellow defendants at the table there. And I don't see any indication of that
Now,
they've got their story and they're sticking to it.
You mentioned to me, though, the other day, Bill, that there was one defendant who did kind of a quick 180. There was some reference to changing a plea, and what's
Well,
that?
actually, that was in a different group. That was in the
okay.
the lead group of defendants, which includes Amy Bock, who was the CEO of Feeding Our Future, and a bunch of people who were organized around the Safari restaurant in Minneapolis.
Okay.
That group has had a couple of guilty pleas, and there was like 13, 14 people in that group, and a couple of them have pled guilty, and there was one who filed a guilty plea and then withdrew it, but that wasn't this group.
So I think one question probably on a lot of people's minds is why this case? As you've been talking about, there have been a lot of guilty pleas, and for whatever reason, this group seems to have solidarity. They've held together. Is there something about this case, that explains why it's the one that's going to trial, or is it just kind of random?
Well, it seems to be that the defendants wanted it. For whatever reason, there's just the one judge, this Nancy Brazel. There is the prosecuting team, and then there's, as I said, 7 or 8 groups of defendants, and there's been this ongoing negotiation about going to trial and trial dates being set. And this group of 8 defendants around the Empire Cuisine have always wanted to go sooner rather than later. And that other group, the lead group of defendants with Amy Bock and the Safari restaurant people, they've always pleaded to go later, trying to delay their trial. So in the back and forth between all of the people involved, they ended up at first at bat, the leadoff hitter.
So I think another question that people have got, certainly a question that I had when you and I started talking about this, Bill, what are the defenses? Everybody thinks it's kind of a foregone conclusion that somebody here stole hundreds of millions of dollars by pretending to feed children that they weren't actually feeding. And yet, there's every indication that these people intend to mount a pretty vigorous defense. Well, what do they have to say for themselves?
Yeah, so unlike Amy Bock and some of the other defendants, this group has never done TV interviews or never put out a statement or anything like that. But you can infer, at least I'm going to infer from their filings, they put out their own exhibit lists. And what's on their exhibit list? What evidence are they going to introduce at the trial the next few weeks? And there, for example, is a exhibit marked photograph of pallet of food. And then there are other exhibits marked videos of food assembly, food distribution, and they're exhibits which are invoices from where they've purchased food in bulk. And I think their first line of defense is, we didn't do anything wrong. We really did feed tens of thousands of children. We really did serve millions and millions of meals, that for whatever reason, we're being persecuted for doing the good work of feeding hungry children. So I think their first line of defense is they're innocent, that they really did feed all those children and they really did deserve all that money, that 49 million that they collected through state government. So I think that's their first line of defense. And again, this trial is going to last for weeks. And I don't know about you, John, but when I was in college, one of the most surefire insomnia cures was reading my accounting textbook. And so this is going to be a huge amount of spreadsheets and bank statements and financial records. And I think the defendants are going to try to counter that with visual evidence, maybe even bring out witnesses saying, no, here's a bag of groceries being handed to a parent, or here's some children sitting at a table eating a meal. We really did feed children. And I think that's their first line of defense.
Do they have children on their witness lists? I mean, they could bring in kids.
Well, interestingly enough, for whatever reason, I don't know federal courtroom procedures, witness lists are not public. These exhibit lists, I can download and read every entry, but the witness lists themselves are not public documents. So I've heard, for example, the witness list for the prosecutors, the federal government, runs to 200 names. And the only people I know who are on the list is when a defense counsel goes and files an objection, or, for example, there's a civilian, somebody not involved in the fraud, who's supposed to be testifying, and the one of the defense counsel says, we're going to bring up their old drunk driving convictions and try to impeach them. But other than these miscellaneous filings, I don't know who's on the list.
I suppose they're trying, it's a criminal case, so they're probably trying to protect potential witnesses from intimidation. I suppose that's the rationale. So you mentioned that the trial is expected to last for several weeks. Any more detail around that? Do you know how many weeks they've got on the calendar?
I've heard they've got up to 2 months. Again, this is a thing I can look at the federal calendar. Again, this is in Minneapolis. I can look at the Minneapolis court calendar, and they only go out 2 weeks. I have heard that initially they went out a month, and I've heard more recently they've gone out a full 2 months in reserving courtroom space for this trial. So it could last weeks, it could last a couple of months, it could drag on into the summer.
So one of our viewers asked a good question, particularly if we're talking about a 2-month long trial, and that is, who's financing the defense attorneys?
Now, it's not true of all defendants. A lot of defendants have public defenders. I'm not 100% positive, but I believe all 8 of these have private attorneys. So presumably they're financing their own defense. Other groups and single defendants have gotten public defenders. And the rationale for that, even though they've been accused of stealing millions of dollars, in a lot of cases, including with these defendants, in the search warrants and in seizures and in forfeiture proceedings, that the feds have taken millions and millions of dollars in bank accounts, and in some instances seized homes and vehicles. So it's not clear how much resources folks have, but I think all of these have private lawyers.
Well, if they stole $49 million, presumably they've got some of that left to pay the lawyers with. So you mentioned, and it's obviously true, it's true in this case, it's true in white collar crime cases generally, and it's true in a huge swath of civil litigation, that you're dealing with very complicated evidence, spreadsheets, as you said, and bank records and stacks of receipts and all this kind of thing to prove how many kids did they actually feed? Like they'll bring in a picture. Here's a kid eating, here's video. We're feeding kids. And so you got to prove, yeah, okay, you did feed some kids, but you didn't feed anywhere near $49 million worth. And that's kind of complicated proof involving a lot of documents. And the way that most often gets handled is through expert witnesses. You hire an expert, and the expert studies all the receipts, and he studies the spreadsheets, and he goes through the bank records, and he puts together charts and graphs and gives opinion testimony to the jury so that they don't have to kind of scratch their heads over, the stack of documents 12 feet high. Do you see that happening here? Do you see these kinds of experts on both sides? Witness lists where you can predict that's what's going to happen, or haven't you seen that?
No, that's definitely what's
We
going to
haven't
happen.
seen the witness lists.
But we've seen the exhibit list, and the
Yeah.
exhibit list, and there's been a lot of fighting and motions about what can be done and what can't be done in front of the jury. And the government's going to start out with witnesses who paint the big picture, who give summary, those charts and graphs you mentioned. They're going to put up summary statistics, charts, graphs, flow charts, trying to give the big picture, and then they're going to drill down all the way down to some receipt or lack of a receipt for some money. So it's super complicated. They're going to try to make it simple for the jury, but I've thought about this a lot. If you're on the jury, you're somebody from Marshall, Minnesota, who's been called to sit on this jury, and the government says they stole 49 million, and the defense says, no, we fed thousands of children. You can only vote guilty or not guilty. There's not 70% guilty, 50% guilty. So at what point do you decide, yes, they've committed a crime, where the government says they stole this, and they say, no, look, this is a video of grocery bags being handed out. If they can prove up they fed, so many children? Do you say, well, the government's overreaching? I don't know. I don't know how you, as a juror, come to a conclusion of who's right and who's wrong when the government never claimed that no children were fed. They have always said that few children were fed, only a small percentage of these meals were actually served. And I have no doubt the defendants can prove that some children were fed. But how far in that gap between how many they can prove up they fed and how much money they took out of the government, where does guilt lie?
Well, I think it's a question of, how big is the discrepancy? If they fed $1 million worth and they put in for $49 million worth, that I don't think if a juror concludes that, he's not going to have any trouble, I don't think, returning a guilty verdict. On the other hand, if it's close enough that you could say, well, maybe it's sloppy bookkeeping, maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle, or, if it's close, then I don't think you get a conviction. But the prosecutors at least must believe that here it's not close.
Correct. And then, millions of pages, 2,000 exhibits, banking records. So I think the first line of defense is going to be, no, we really fed the kids. The second line of defense is, we didn't do it. So there are going to be a couple of witnesses, and I know this because they're on the exhibit list. We've got a couple of witnesses who've already pled guilty in the case. They've already submitted guilty pleas. They were insiders in Feeding Our Future or some other nonprofit. They've already filed their guilty plea, and I'm pretty sure the defense is going to say, no, we're not the guilty ones. Those people who've already pled guilty, they're the real criminals. They're just trying to drag us down with them to curry favor with the judge and get a lighter sentence. On that same ledger, there are 3 defendants in the case, 3 of the 70 who fled the country and have never returned. So they'll say, oh, no, we're not the guilty ones. Those 3 guys who fled the country and went to Africa or Asia, they're the real guilty ones. You should go after them, get them extradited. Because you haven't done that, you're just trying to blame storm somebody else that you can get a hold of. And then in this exhibit list, there are a couple of dozen names of people who, because their bank records are included and other items are included in the exhibit list, I categorize as the unindicted co-conspirators, people who haven't been charged with anything, but who look like they might have some culpability. So they can say, oh, no, it wasn't us. It was those people you didn't indict. You indicted the wrong 8 people. We're the innocent ones. The 8 people you should have charged are those people over there. So the blame shifting, I think, might be their second line of defense.
You said that, Bill, as if you are one of the defendants saying, no, I'm not the guilty one. And that, of
Right.
course, raises the question, these people don't have to testify. We all know that under the Fifth Amendment. But have you seen any indication? Is there any possibility? Do you see anything in the filings that makes you think that one or more of these defendants might actually take the stand?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is there could be a chance. I've seen a couple of the defendants really object hard, filing motions on these conspiracy charges. And so you have instances where they say, we've been charged with conspiracy, but a lot of these emails, a lot of these banking documents, a lot of these financial transactions don't involve us, that they involve 2 or more of the other 8 defendants. And so there might be instances where one of the defendants says this conspiracy charge should be thrown out, or that conspiracy charge could be thrown out because I didn't participate in that transaction, or I had nothing to do with that nonprofit, or this shell company that you've spent 2 days talking about, I never did anything with them. So the conspiracy, all 8 alleged to have worked together, but on each individual transaction, all 8 are involved. Each individual transaction might involve only 2 or 3 or 4 of the defendants, but the others were not involved in that particular aspect of it. So I could see cleavages where somebody might decide, I'm going to get on the stand to say, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. My role is extremely narrow, but I don't know, that's just speculation on my part.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what the conviction rate is currently in the federal court in the Twin Cities, but I think over the years, conviction rates in federal court have been in excess of 95%. And the conventional wisdom is that it's very, very difficult to get acquitted if you don't take the stand. Now, it can be hard to get acquitted if you do take the stand. There's a reason why criminal defendants, rarely choose to testify. But if a juror sits there for 6 weeks or 8 weeks hearing all this evidence against a criminal defendant, and the criminal defendant chooses to stay silent, you know, statistically, you don't see an awful lot of acquittals. So, we'll see if this case bucks that trend or not. Speaking of the jurors, though, you mentioned the idea of a juror from Marshall. I'm sure one thing our listeners are wondering is, well, who's on the jury? If we had a jury of people from Minneapolis, knowing how things are going in Minneapolis these days, goodness knows what they might do. So a really important question in this case is, what's the jury pool?
Yeah, again, it's different from a criminal trial, which occurs in a county. So if somebody in Hennepin County were accused of murder or, carjacking or something like that, then the jury pool would come from the county. And so federal court in Minnesota is a little different in that there's only one federal district. Lots of states have, the middle district of Tennessee or something like that. We just have the District of Minnesota. But there are several federal courthouses around the state. There's one up in Duluth. There's one in St. Paul. And so it would appear that each federal court has its own zone. And the Minneapolis federal court zone kind of starts from Minneapolis and goes to the south and to the west. And it extends all the way to the South Dakota border. Now, the population center of the Minneapolis court is Hennepin County. So you would expect a plurality of potential jurors to come from nearby the big population center. But the Southwest Metro, adjoining counties, all the way, I mentioned Marshall, Wilmer, potential that jurors could come from there. And I think that actually might be the third line of defense for the defendants is jury selection is going to be super critical, and maybe they can find people who are sympathetic to their viewpoint. So they might perhaps make an ethnic appeal or a racial appeal to jurors, hope for a hung jury or jury nullification. But it's not like a lot of these trials we hear about that happen in Manhattan or happen in the District of Columbia, where the jury pool is fairly uniform, people drawn from a small geographic area. In theory, it's about a third of the state, I think, or a quarter of the state could be drawn into this jury.
Yeah, these are divisions, right? So this is the Minneapolis division, and as you say, it covers basically the southwest quadrant of the state, and so it ought to be a pretty diverse jury. On the other hand, if a couple of stubborn jurors could hang a jury too.
Right. So it's a criminal case. It requires unanimity beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden of proof, of course, is on the prosecutor. The government has to prove its case. And so I fully expect you'll hear for the next few weeks or months, they haven't met their burden of proof. They haven't met their burden of proof. They haven't proved beyond a reasonable doubt. And you must acquit because we've showed you that video of grocery bags being handed out. So I think the jury selection, as is most trials, super critical. Interesting, again, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding from the filings made in this case, and perhaps as a relief, because there are 8 different sets of lawyers, the judge conducts the voir dire. The judge does the interviewing of the jurors, and each lawyer's team doesn't get their own crack at it. But on the back end, apparently, when there are witnesses on the stand, each of the 8 sets of lawyers gets to cross-examine. So one of the reasons why this thing could drag on for months.
Yep. And as you say, in the state courts, the practice generally is that the lawyers do the voir dire. They get up and talk to the potential jurors and try to develop relationships with them and schmooze them and get information about them. In the federal court, and trial lawyers hate this, the federal court, you can't do that. You submit proposed questions to the judge ahead of time, but the judge will actually interact with the jurors and ask the questions. And so you don't have that opportunity to try to develop rapport, one-on-one with the people in the jury pool. Well, let's just assume for the moment that we get some guilty verdicts here. What kind of sentences, after all the process we've been through, 2 years, all the news stories, all the indictments, the big stack of filings that you've seen accumulating in the court, possibility of a 2 month long trial. When all is said and done, what kind of sentences are these people potentially looking at?
Well, years in federal prison. So, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, these counts could stack up. But none, as I mentioned, none of the 18 who have pled guilty have been sentenced to anything. In fact, there has been only one conviction where a sentence was handed down related to this case. And I mentioned the two co-owners of the Empire Cuisine. Uh, Interestingly enough, both of them were arrested initially not for the alleged food fraud, but they were arrested for passport fraud. So when the FBI and the ATF, not the ATF, the IRS agents all raided these locations and these search warrants that were executed back in January of 2022 on that very cold morning. They raided the private homes of many of the defendants. And these two guys, Farah and Ismail, they raided their private homes and took their passports. So the FBI seized their passports as part of the raids, along with banking records, their cell phones, cash that they had on hand. And so they didn't have passports, and both of them
Well, and they
applied.
do that so they can't leave the country.
Right. So there was a concern, and there has always been a concern of defendants, because we had 3 who fled the country already. So there was concern that these defendants would flee. They seized their passports. Those 2 gentlemen, Farah and Ismail, applied to the State Department for passports to be reissued. And both of them got brand new passports under the false claim that they had lost their passports. They didn't know where their passports were. Actually, they did know where their passports were. They were locked in a safe in the FBI offices in downtown Minneapolis. But they got their passports reissued, and both of them purchased plane tickets overseas. And one of the 2 was actually arrested on the jetway at Minneapolis Airport, about to board a flight for Amsterdam. So just imagine this scene where this guy is standing in there with his carry-on bag, and a bunch of guys in dark suits come and take him away. And another guy, they arrested him actually the day before his flight was supposed to leave. But one of the 2 was actually convicted of passport fraud. Pled guilty, was convicted of passport fraud, and was sentenced to time served, which was like 2 or 3 weeks. So here we have an example of somebody convicted in the case who didn't actually get any additional jail time. For a time, they had him up in Sherburne County in lockup because they were afraid he would flee the country. But they convicted him of passport fraud, let him go, and he's been on his own since then.
Bill, is there anything else you'd like to add? I think we've kind of covered the case, what it's all about, as best we can in terms of the trial procedure. Anything else you want to add before we go to questions from the audience?
I do. I didn't really cover the where of this case. So the idea is they took $49 million out of the free food programs, and they had dozens of sites where they allegedly fed children. And the bulk of the sites in this group of defendants is in the South Metro or the Southwest Metro. So we have the restaurant in Shakopee, we have the school in Burnsville. And then I know we have a photo of one of the other sites, which always jumped out at me. I actually drove down to Burnsville one day and took a picture of this. It's a city park. It's called Cliff Fen Park. And this is a picture of the sign. You can't really tell from the sign, but there's some playground equipment there. There are no buildings. And the idea is once a week, a truck would pull up. And this truck would be full of bags of groceries, and they would distribute groceries to whoever showed up. And as far as I can tell, they didn't really have permission from the city to use their land as a distribution site, but they did. And another site that struck my eye, and I took a picture of it, is in a strip mall in Burnsville, and it's just an empty storefront. There's a convenience store, gas station at one end of the strip mall in Burnsville, and at the other end is a child daycare center. And this particular location has interests me because it was on the list of locations that the government's going to try to prove were bogus, that there were no children fed at this location. And this particular office suite, this particular retail space, was leased by Amy Bock herself, who is not on trial next week. Her trial won't happen until the fall or sometime after that. But she leased this office space that this group claimed to be feeding children through. And again, it was just an empty, and it was thousands of children were supposed to be fed out of this storefront at this very small strip mall, and only a few dozen parking spaces. And but again, the case, there's some Minneapolis locations, a St. Paul location, but a lot of the locations are Burnsville, Faribault, Owatonna, Shakopee, those locations in the south exurban, southwest suburban quadrant of the Twin Cities.
You mentioned Amy Bock, and some of our listeners just may not remember who she is, but a pivotal figure in this whole story.
Yeah, she was the founder of two of the major nonprofits who have been implicated in this. One is called Feeding Our Future, their most famous one. A lesser known one also took out $250 million out of this program, and it's called Partners in Nutrition, and it did business under the name Partners in Quality Care. And she founded both of them, but there was a split, and then she went off and founded her own Feeding Our Future. And it's interesting looking at court documents. These were bitter rivals, these two nonprofits, always poaching each other's clients. But interestingly enough, this group of defendants is accused of stealing money from the feds through both of these networks. So she's not, her name comes up on the exhibit list a bunch of times. I don't know if she's going to testify because her trial hasn't come up yet. She's pleaded not guilty, but she's kind of been the face of this group. And she is not of Somali ethnicity. So, and she did a lot of TV interviews early in the process before she hired a lawyer. So it's interesting. Her name will come up, but she's not on trial.
So Dwayne, one of our listeners, just asked this question: Is Bock the nexus for all of this, or is the case named for her group because she's the only non-Somali? My liberal friends are convinced she duped innocent immigrants. Any comment on that theory?
Well, again, everything is alleged, but I have it on good authority. People who I would consider to be insiders have told me that this was a business strategy, that she was trying to, and both of these groups, Partners in Nutrition and Feeding Our Future, targeted is probably the wrong word, courted people who operated daycares and nonprofits who primarily served immigrant clientele. And to that end, she hired a ethnic Somali person who was very familiar with that community, who helped recruit sites, who helped recruit daycares. I mentioned a couple of those sites. There were a lot of sites in this cases were houses of worship. They were apartment complexes, trailer parks. They were, and almost all of the people mentioned in this came from the Somali ethnic group, but there are other ethnic groups involved as well, Hispanic, Hmong, and in Catholic churches, Lutheran churches, who were sites for this as well. But if you listen to her, she's the victim. Amy Bock was duped by these people who ripped off her as well as the government. But then if you listen to other people, that this was a business plan, a business strategy to kind of corner the market in signing up distribution sites who serve certain ethnic communities.
So if you've got a question for Bill, now's the time. Type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Bill, there's a couple of questions about just sort of mechanics of the upcoming trial starting on Monday. One of our viewers wants to know where and when exactly, if the public wants to attend the trial. All I will say is bring no-dos with you if you do that. But what's the where and when if somebody wants to actually show up and see this in action?
Yeah. So I don't have it in front of me, but they have assigned a courtroom. It's from memory, 9 a.m. Monday morning, the federal courthouse building in downtown Minneapolis. It's a fairly new glass building. It's kind of hard to miss. And at least, again, you can only look for the first couple of weeks ahead on the court schedule. They've reserved an overflow room. So presumably there's a room that you can sit in and watch the trial through some sort of closed circuit TV if all of the public spaces fill up in the main courtroom. So it's a trial, it's open to the public, on a space available basis. So you can sit in the back of the room and watch the proceedings. And if I'm guessing the first day, there's going to be a lot of media coverage. So maybe the overflow room will be in play. No cameras in the courtroom. I don't know if we're going to get those court sketch artists that you see in other more famous cases to draw pictures of all the people involved. But I myself might put in an appearance a few weeks down the road. I'm guessing the first couple of, at least for the first week's going to be jury selection and all the preliminaries, and the real action's not going to be maybe until next month. And I'm guessing after the first couple of days, public interest will die down, and you might be able to sit in the back of the room and watch the show in person.
The opening statements might be interesting to catch. If you follow along when they got the jury picked and the opening statements are on the calendar, that might be a good thing to see. Carl, another of our viewers asks, will the government pay for hotels for jurors from outside the metro? I think Carl lives in Wilmer, and that he thinks he might be on the jury panel. I don't know, but I think that, I don't, honestly, it's hard for me to remember that. It's been a while since I tried a case in that courthouse, but I think the answer is yes. They've got some kind of if you come from a certain distance, they will put you up. I think that's the answer.
Yeah. Cottonwood County is a long ways away. It's tough.
It's a long drive to and from. It's a long turnaround if you're in court all day. A couple of our viewers have asked questions about state employees, and this is something that we've heard this question many times over the last 2 years. I guess question number one is, are there any state employees who have been indicted?
No, there's not been any state employees. And this has been a personal frustration for mine, that according to the structure of how this stuff is regulated, the State Department of Education is the agent for the federal government in Minnesota. They're in charge of regulating every aspect of these and other federal food programs. And there has not been anybody who's been indicted or even accused of any wrongdoing. In fact, one of the lines of defense that the defendants might take is that this has all been a story concocted by the State Department of Education, that they are racist. They have it in for immigrant children. They don't want immigrant children to be fed, or there's some sort of bigotry where they just can't believe that these immigrant business people, mostly businessmen, were so astute that they could provide tens of millions in meals and somehow do it at a big profit. At such a low cost and
right?
high profit margin.
So the government will prove, you sucked $40 million out of the program, but you only spent $8 million on food or whatever those numbers are. Right. And so one response to that is to say, well, what, you got a problem with capitalism?
What, you can't do that? You can't serve $50 million worth of food for $8 million?
Yeah,
why
we're so efficient, that we made money on the deal. Right. I think we may very well hear that theme from the defendants.
But just to bash the Department of Education a little bit more, there was only a very narrow period when Republicans controlled the state Senate after the scandal broke. The scandal broke in late January. Session was still going on at the Capitol. Republicans controlled the state Senate. They actually had a series of hearings on this and had some of the Department of Education officials in front of them trying to answer questions. They didn't get many answers, and then session gavelled out and Republicans lost the majority, and there haven't been any hearings since. The Office of a Legislative Auditor is supposed to have been investigating the Department of Education's oversight of this. They were supposed to have issued a report last year. They were supposed to have issued a report this year. Here we are almost to May, and no report has been forthcoming. So there really should be a reckoning about how the administration and the Department of Education and all the people who work there have handled this scandal. How did $500 million walk out the door with you guys not doing anything? And their answer is, we're the heroes because we called the cops. We gave this all to the FBI, and then our hands are free. And I calculated After the date they handed this over to the FBI, another $200 million went out the door. And, again, what was interesting after the FBI raids, then suddenly the Department of Education grew a spine. So they would send out checks, they would pay invoices, no questions asked. But the day the FBI raids occurred, they never sent out another dollar to these folks. There are millions and millions of dollars in unpaid invoices that the Department of Education says, we're not going to pay. And why couldn't they have done that a year before, 2 years before? I hope we get answers.
And another of our viewers asked a related question that I think is a good follow-up, and that is there any sign of any changes in policy? I mean, has the Department of Education put out new guidelines or something at least to show that they've learned from the experience?
A little bit. So when they passed the budget last year at the state capitol, they included some money to hire a new inspector general at the State Department of Education and hire more investigators to go out and actually, they're supposed to have gone to all these thousands of locations and independently verified that food was actually going out. One thing we haven't mentioned, that the early days of the scandal were both enabled by and happened during COVID. So those on-site inspections largely never happened because people feared spreading COVID around. So one of the things that happened that they were supposed to have hired more investigators, hired an inspector general. But again, one of the most frustrating aspects of this whole scandal is $250 million, maybe $500 million for these two food programs. But most of the defendants, most of these 70 individuals who have been charged, also operated corporate entities that took money out of other government programs, whether it was for personal care attendants or non-emergency medical transportation or childcare or adult daycare. And these other agencies that are involved, mostly the Department of Human Services, DHS, has taken the position, well, just because you've been charged with or pled guilty to robbing one government program doesn't mean we have the authorization to close you out from another government program. So there have been tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that these folks have gotten out of other government programs, and some of them are still getting paid out of other government programs.
And we know, Bill, that there's been substantial amounts of fraud in childcare programs funded by the state, where they've got a list of kids. Once again, we're talking about children, a list of kids supposedly in daycare day after day. Well, there are no such kids. They're invented children. And it's kind of infuriating that, having been caught stealing millions of dollars with fake children in one government program, you're still in business in a different government program.
Well, they are, and a number of them had child care facilities. In fact, that's where a lot of the whole food program did. This is in addition to the school nutrition program where kids get a free or reduced price lunch while they're at school. The purpose of these programs was to feed kids after school and after school programs, or during the summer when school's out of session. So these two programs, of the thousands of locations, hundreds and hundreds of them are daycare facilities who feed kids who are too young to go to school, or they're feeding kids who are being taken care of in after school programs or summer programs. So there's a very tight child care, free food nexus.
So one of our viewers asked a question that, again, flows pretty naturally from what we've been talking about here, and that is, with all the waste in government programs, where will the jury draw the line between bureaucratic government inefficiencies and actual fraud? And let me just add to that, Bill, that we have several times in our Thinking Minnesota poll asked the open-ended question of Minnesotans, just what's your best estimate, based on everything you see and hear, of the percentage of Minnesota state government spending that is wasted? And the last time we asked that question, the median answer was 34%. So, I'm not sure what way that cuts. I mean, our viewer asked a really interesting question. There is so blankety blank much waste going on. How are these people any different from the rest of the government?
I got to say, my cynicism grows the longer I dig into this sort of stuff. I'd put that number over 50%. But, in one thing that's going to help the government, I think, is back to this whole issue of the profit margin, because they're going to show in this money laundering case that these folks were able to buy private homes, commercial real estate, send millions of dollars overseas to Africa and Asia, Gucci bags, all kinds of jewelry, Las Vegas
Luxury
vacations,
vehicles.
luxury automobiles. Yeah, Tesla, Porsche. I didn't know in this case you could spend $100,000 on a pickup truck, but apparently you can if you try hard enough. So they're going to show that these folks were not just hardworking businessmen who were able to make a profit margin. These people were pocketing the money and spending on luxury goods that you, the juror, will never even be able to touch, much less own yourself. So there are going to be a lot of exhibits around the swag, all the money that was spent on luxury goods and properties, not just in Minnesota, but they purchased real estate for a house of worship in Louisville, Kentucky, built private homes in Columbus, Ohio with this money. I think that's going to catch the jurors and might be something they can relate to and latch onto, because they're going to go numb with all the accounting stuff. But the swag, the jewelry bought in Dubai, the automobiles, the lakeside homes, that's something they can relate to.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. One of our viewers says Amy Bock alleged a bunch of potential legal violations by state officials in one of her filings. Do you think we will get any more on that when her trial starts? Well, let me ask you first, Bill, have you seen anything in the filings for this case that suggests that state employees are going to be put on trial by defendants in that kind of way?
Yes, and why I see that is there were a whole series of motions which I think were eventually resolved, where they tried to compel either officials at Department of Education or data information from the Department of Education. So they've been alleging that there's this exculpatory information that the Department of Education has been holding back or hiding from the defendants. And I think that all got kind of worked out in pretrial stuff, but there's definitely of undercurrent of we're on trial, but we're going to try to flip it and put the Department of Education on trial.
Yeah. We're just about out of time here, but one of our attendees asked the question, what do you know about the disposition of the property in Lakeville that has been included in this scandal? Signed, a Lakeville resident. And this is something, I think he's talking about something you've written about on our website, Bill. What's the story there?
Right. Well, there's a defendant in a different group, a defendant who's not part of this group of defendants. If you believe the feds, they allegedly used some of her ill-gotten gains to buy, I can't remember how many acres in Lakeville, right off of I-35, to develop an apartment complex. And that piece of land they sued for forfeiture. The feds have tried to seize it as part of a case, but she is not part of this group of defendants. She's part of a different group of defendants. So as far as the trial starting Monday, I don't think there's a nexus between that parcel of land in Lakeville and these 8 defendants, but definitely there's a parcel of land associated with a group that wants to build a controversial housing development that has connections to Feeding Our Future.
Let's take one last question. It's almost 1 o'clock, but one of our viewers asked, what are the odds that we will get all or any of those tax dollars back? Talk about that if you would, Bill, because there's been a fair effort already made to claw back some of these.
So again, nobody's kept a running total, but I would say they've already clawed back tens of millions of dollars, 10 cents on the dollar, 20 cents on the dollar already by seizing bank accounts, cash, vehicles, properties. So they've already clawed back some of it, but they'll never get all of it because some of it was spent on consumables. They Las Vegas, international travel, junkets to Las Vegas. They spent it on restaurant meals, that sort of stuff. They spent it on rent So a lot of that's never coming back. It's gone forever. Almost all the guilty pleas, or I should say all the guilty pleas, have a provision in it for restitution, that the defendants, once they plead guilty, are supposed to pay back the full amount of what they spent. But that money, a lot of that money is gone, and we'll never see it again.
Well, Bill Glahn, your reporting has really driven this story from the very beginning. Kudos to you. I'm sure you're going to stay on the case. And when this trial is over and we have verdicts, I could foresee us doing another one of these webinars and see what are the takeaways. We'll find out what the jury does.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, John.
And thanks to all of you for participating. Have a good day.